To escape the darkness of our present, many of us look to the future. It seems that from our very beginnings, humanity has turned to seers, prophets, reading the stars, cards, our palms, sacred writings, anything to give us a glimpse of what the future holds. The Gospels tell of a prophet as well, one that claimed to shine a light in the darkness. But curiously, it wasn't by providing veiled glimpses into the future. It was through an obsession with improving his present reality. Prophets are a big part of many of the world's major religions. And when you look at Christianity today, there's a common theme of trying to reveal the future. We all want to know what the future holds, and much of modern Christianity plays off of that desire, using sacred texts to unlock the secrets or discover the mysteries of the future. Yet when we turn to the Gospels, we see a Jesus who's much less concerned with revealing the future and more concerned with improving the present.
When we go back to the moment in the synagogue where Jesus first announced his revolution, we see that he taught as a rabbi. He referred to himself as a healer, and we also see that he claimed the title of prophet. And as he read from the words of another prophet, Isaiah, he presented a message of God's radical acceptance of those rejected by Jesus' society. The poor, prisoners, the blind, the oppressed, even of unbelieving Gentiles. As a prophet, Jesus was on a mission to bring together all the different people his world had condemned and neglected.
New York is a big, busy, people-filled place. Even so, there are pockets of the city that somehow feel neglected. One of those is the neighborhood of Hunts Point in South Bronx. It's been called a red light district due to its high crime rate and prostitution. Nearly half its population lives under the poverty line. Chances are if you visit New York, you don't make it up here. But I'm glad I did, because I got the chance to talk to someone who's bringing his community together. No, he's not exactly a prophet, but I did come to think of him by a different title, the mayor. His name is Jermaine Thompson, and while he doesn't hold any official public office, he is a leader in his community. He heads up a nonprofit called Hunts Point Unity. But before we get into that, Jermaine showed me around his neighborhood, along with his kids and friend Ed. And from the first steps, it was clear that people in Hunts Point know Jermaine.
Yeah, I told you. Well, like I said, it's just to fit in. What's up, Mississippi? All right.
Like I said, the mayor. Hunts Point loves him, and he loves it back. That was clear as he showed me around his neighborhood, the buildings that have changed, where he used to live as a kid, the hangout spots. Hunts Point doesn't exactly get a lot of visitors, and Jermaine wanted to show an outsider around his home. As we walked, I asked about the mood in the neighborhood lately, with the string of police violence being reported in the media. And he described a community on edge.
Yeah, the tension goes up because at the same token, they're on edge, we're on edge. And you also have to look at it from the standpoint of with NYPD, as you're in the training room, when you come out, you're going into a bad neighborhood. You're already on edge, like you're scared. You're more worried about what can happen.
Jermaine understands it's not easy for a cop to work in his neighborhood, but at the same time, he knows what it's like to live there. So after having spent some time away from home, Jermaine came back to Hunts Point looking for some unity.
It's like came back to Hunts Point with a mission. That's basically what it is.
Came back from
Yeah, it's like a lot of people who sit there don't care about it, but we here. It's time to change. Like if they're changing up the buildings and everything, why not try to change up the people with it? You know, you don't have to move people out. You know, you just keep everybody there and just keep working.
And I could see the results of that work towards unity just in walking around the neighborhood with him, as Jermaine took what would normally be a scary sight for some, a cop pulling over to come talk to you, into a warm, friendly interaction.
Yeah, like he comes around. He plays basketball also. Yeah, so that's what I talk about, bridging the gap. Yeah, that's how you gotta do it.
And bridging the gap is exactly what Hunts Point Unity does. We sat down to talk about it.
Hunts Point Unity is actually an organization that we're just bridging the gap between the youth and the adults, bringing everybody together the same way with the 41st Precinct that we're bringing in it, because, you know, lately there's been a lot of police brutality. So it's like we're just bridging the gap. We're trying to make it where everybody gets involved. We don't want just a certain crowd to be involved. Like NYPD, they participate in the Stop the Violence basketball tournament.
So that's what Hunts Point Unity does. They organize different sporting events throughout the neighborhood to create opportunities for people that normally wouldn't to come together. And according to Jermaine, that's something Hunts Point desperately needs.
Yes, it does need bringing together. You have a lot of people that have animosity towards each other. And sometimes it can be race, sometimes it can be just gangs. So, you know, and this brings people together. I think, like, every time we do the Turkey Bowl, we have over 280 people out here on Thanksgiving.
Wow.
So, you know, it's like a big rivalry, but at the same token, it's respectful. It's not, everybody's not, like he sat next to somebody that he couldn't get along with. I played against somebody I could never get along with. So, you know, and it's like for us to now, we're all gelling like we're one big family.
That's why I came to think of Jermaine as the mayor of Hunts Point. He has a unique gift for bringing people together, no matter how diverse or divided. And yeah, while he may not be a prophet, when we first met, he did have some prophetic-sounding words, predicting it would start raining at 4 p.m. Sure enough, 4 o'clock rolled around and... We'll be seeing more of Jermaine's story later on, but for now, suffice it to say, I'm glad I made it up to Hunts Point. There, I saw that if you want to see a better future, you need people who are willing to work to transform their present.
The prophets that came before Jesus regularly pointed to the future through warnings and visions. But they also worked tirelessly to improve their present reality. They claimed to bring a message from God, to call the religious cultures of their times to turn back to Him and bring justice for those their society had neglected. Back in that moment in the synagogue, Jesus gave examples of how God had used prophets to provide care for people Jesus' religious culture hated and rejected, such as how God used the prophet Elijah to provide food and sustenance to a pagan widow and her son, who otherwise would have starved to death in a famine, and using the prophet Elisha to heal and transform a heathen warlord from Syria. This message of God's radical acceptance was so despised by the religious group there in that synagogue that they were driven to murderous rage. This may seem shocking to us now, but when we look through the Judeo-Christian scriptures, we see that a prophet fighting for a message of God's compassion and acceptance against an entrenched religious culture was nothing new. For instance, the prophet Jonah was an ordinary man sent by God to a city outside of his religious group, Nineveh, that was steeped in violence, and God showed them compassion. Joel addressed his religious community in Judah, calling them to return to God and embrace a life of compassion. The prophet Amos was just a simple shepherd who fought against the complacency within his religious group, calling them to return to God and focus on justice. The prophet Hosea's life was a message in itself. as he married a promiscuous woman, and as an example of God's continual forgiveness and compassion, he forgave her and took her back every time she was unfaithful. The great prophet Isaiah, whose writings Jesus read in the synagogue, called his religious group to return to God and care for the poor and disenfranchised they had neglected. Even the prophet Daniel, famous for his mysterious visions of the future, prominently displayed civil disobedience by defying his government's law restricting his religious freedom. The prophets before Jesus regularly fought for acceptance, compassion, and justice, often in the face of religious resistance. This was true for Jesus as well. That's why he referred to himself as a prophet without honor. It may not have endeared him to the religious leaders of his time, but Jesus the prophet always pushed God's message of compassion, mercy, and justice for those less fortunate.
It's a very religious-sounding title, but a prophet's role was not to push the message of a particular religious sect. It was actually much more transcendent than that. Jesus and the prophets before him all claimed to carry a message directly from God, oftentimes one that called on the religious group of their time to change. And that's important for us to remember today, to not look at this prophet through a particular religious lens, because that word, religion, well, it can be very complicated. Lately, there seems to be shifting views on religion, especially among younger generations. So I headed to Manhattan's Upper West Side to talk to some of New York's best and brightest young minds outside of Columbia University to get their perspective on religion. And when I asked them about their personal religious beliefs, the responses pretty much ran the gamut.
I'll ask you the question, are you religious?
No, I'm not at all.
Okay.
I'm agnostic.
Yes, I am. I'm a Christian and I belong to a Baptist church.
No. Well, I was raised by a Presbyterian mother and a Catholic father.
Yes, I am. Hindu.
I wouldn't say massively. I grew up in a reasonably religious home, Christian home.
Not really.
No?
No. I mean, I think religion's meant for some people, not everyone. I think whatever you want to believe in, you can believe in it.
Yeah, I do consider myself a religious person, I guess. I practice Reformed Judaism.
Yes, I am. I'm also Jewish. I'm a conservative Jew.
Not really, no.
Okay. No?
Not yet, but I went to Bible study quite a lot.
Yeah, Christian.
I would say more spiritual.
And while there was a wide spectrum in personal religious beliefs, every single person I talked to expressed a nuanced view of religion as something that could be either positive or negative. And for many of those who identified as non-religious, their dissatisfaction didn't really have as much to do with the spiritual aims of religion, so much as the way it was used.
No, I think spirituality is really important.
Can you talk about that delineation on what is spiritual and then what about religion that is separate from that you don't respond to?
Well, I guess I don't belong to a specific congregation. I don't have specific rules, I guess, about how I can talk to a higher being, or at least that's how it's played out within, the Presbyterian Catholic conflict in my life. But for me, it's just believing in a higher power and, sort of connecting with that as opposed to being within the sort of sets of rules and obligations that fall within religion.
You don't want any barriers between you and that higher power then?
Yeah, I don't believe in any barriers.
Even after having had a negative experience with religion, there are still those who seek the spiritual experience of connecting to that higher power. And when religion fails to provide that, when it becomes a barrier rather than a conduit, it needs to change. And Jesus, the prophet without honor, fought for that change, no matter the cost.
When we look at the prophets leading up to and including Jesus, we see that the notion of seeking change within the religious culture of your time was nothing new. In fact, this was one of the key functions of the prophets, including Jesus. They were revolutionaries that called the religious culture of their time to reform. This was frequently met with anger, violence, and even death, as it was with Jesus.
But that's the life of a prophet without honor. To try and make a difference at the expense of everything, even your own life.
Looking at religion today, just as it's always been, there are problems. But it's one thing to point out what's wrong with the world. It's another thing to do something about it. And that's exactly what this prophet did.
Words like performance, show, spectacle. They're a part of the conversation when you talk about New York. From its iconic music halls to its fabled theaters, epic concert venues, all the way down to the street performers in Central Park. No place pulsates with the thrumming of performance quite like New York. If you ask me, it's a beautiful thing. A great performance can communicate something deeply human. Something that goes beyond cultures and languages. Something true, meaningful, transcendent. But when a word like performance becomes attached to words like dogma, religion, and spirituality, something much less sincere happens. In fact, a different word comes to mind.
Hypocrite is the most frequently used word that Jesus used to describe the religious leaders of his time. Today, this word carries a very negative connotation, but in the time of Jesus, it wouldn't have. The word hypocrite is derived from the Greek word hypokrites, which simply means a stage actor. And in a Greek stage production, the actors would have always worn masks. Jesus took the word hypocrites and repurposed it to refer to the religious people he encountered that lived duplicitous lives. Those who presented one thing on the outside, but were something else entirely on the inside. But there was one key difference between the religious leaders and the hypocrites that would have performed in this theater. The people that sat in these seats knew they were going to see a performance. Conversely, the religious hypocrites of Jesus' time made their charade a secret. They didn't want people to know they were wearing a mask. Jesus was not just calling them hypocrites. He was exposing them for what they really were.
If you go to New York, you have to see a Broadway play. There's nothing like it. There are more quality stage productions here in the theater district than in any other place in the world. And even with all the different forms of media available to us, Broadway thrives because there's nothing like a good play. In that theater, the audience and the stage actors enter into this unspoken agreement that for the next few hours, the actors on stage are going to adopt a role and put on a performance that will take something the audience knows is a charade and transport them, hopefully making them feel something profoundly real. That's what I find so fascinating about Jesus' stage actor analogy. It looks at the connection, or maybe the lack of one, between what you present on the outside and what's true inside of you. To explore that further, I went to a cafe in the theater district to talk to a Broadway stage actor. His name is Clifton Davis.
I have had a 47-year career in the entertainment industry. I did my first job, which was a Broadway show named Hello, Dolly, in 1967.
And Broadway has been a passion of his since he was very young.
I fell in love with Broadway when I first saw my first Broadway show, and it became the passion of my life.
But Clifton Davis is a man of many talents, and even though Broadway was his first passion, his career as an entertainer has branched into many different paths.
So I've had a good career. I've done 3 television series. I've done 8 Broadway shows.
His acting work on stage has earned him a Tony nomination, but he's also written some hit songs.
I'm a songwriter. I used to write for Motown. I wrote pop music for Motown. I wrote for Michael Jackson. Never Can Say Goodbye, Looking Through the Windows, a couple of my songs that I wrote for him, and for other artists on Motown back in the day. So I've been a busy beaver in my artistic career.
All over the place, great.
But lately he's come back to acting on stage. At the time of our talk, he'd recently finished a run on the Broadway hit Wicked, and was currently in the Broadway adaptation of Aladdin. And we talked about the work that goes into putting a successful stage production together.
A great deal of work. Even though it may not seem like it to the ordinary viewer, to the audience member. may look like it's all smooth and it just works like clockwork. I'm here to tell you that comes from hundreds of hours of serious rehearsal.
It may be a lot of work, but all it takes is to hear Clifton talk about Aladdin to know he has a lot of passion for what he does.
Just our opening when the curtain goes up. Our curtain doesn't go up. Our curtain disappears.
Whoa.
And you go, hey, how'd they do that?
Right.
Look at me, I'm getting all excited thinking about it.
And as our conversation turned more towards the craft of acting, I asked about the differences between acting on stage and acting on camera. Rather than just tell me, he showed me, acting out his current role as the Sultan as an example.
So when I'm on stage, it's much larger so that people in the back can see it. So I express myself in larger terms, larger moves and gestures. So I would come to Jafar and say, any word on how it's going with intensity and intention, and I want an answer. So I do it with a gesture like this on stage. If I were on film, it compresses.
Acting with a camera there instead of an audience is totally different.
Camera could see you thinking. So you really just need to think the right thoughts without the size. And so you bring it down. So I would do this on film. I would come in and go, any word on how it's going? So you would look that way, but you don't do a gesture. You just turn your eyes.
And that focus on the internal is key to an actor. It may seem like an actor's job is to just fake it, to pretend.
But what you're really doing is living. You're feeling your intentions, and your feelings are coming out.
What Clifton emphasized many times is whether you're on stage or screen, the heart of acting is about getting to the heart.
And then you find the truth of that moment within yourself, and you project that through living it.
It may be part of a charade, a show, but good acting is all about being truthful on the inside.
Jesus had finally had enough of the lies and deceit inside the hearts and minds of his religious leaders. Towards the end of his gospel, Matthew dedicates an entire chapter to Jesus' scathing indictment of their duplicity. In this chapter, Jesus uses language of a fiery passion unlike anything else in the Gospels to describe people whose focus was purely on the outside, only for show, while inside was only lies and darkness. They don't practice what they preach. Everything they do is for people to see. They love the place of honor and the most important seats. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You hypocrites, blind guides, you blind fools! You hypocrites, you give 1/10 of your spices, but you have neglected the most important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. You hypocrites, you're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of filth and the bones of the dead. You hypocrites, you build tombs for the prophets. You're descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell? Upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth. And then, Jesus ends his fiery assault with tender grief, mourning over the beloved city, Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers. How often I have wanted to gather your children together, as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. After all of his righteous anger, what Jesus the prophet really wanted was to mend his fractured religious culture.
Clifton Davis is a Christian, and his faith is very important to him. It's a part of everything he does.
And so God has opened the door for me to share my faith around the theater, where we have prayer circle every performance.
Really?
Every performance.
And his work and his faith intersect on an even deeper level. In his work as an actor, to find the inner truth of his character, Clifton sees a fundamental connection to Jesus.
Let me share another thing about truth, the truth, and how a fantasy conveys truth.
Okay.
Jesus spoke often in parables. Parables were not necessarily true stories.
Right.
They were stories with a meaning, stories with a purpose, stories with a point.
Always a storyteller, Clifton recounted one.
A man had 2 sons.
It's a well-known one. One of the sons asks his father for his inheritance early. He goes off, squanders it, makes a mess of his life, winds up sleeping in a pig pen, and then, at his lowest point, decides to see if his father might take him back, just as a servant.
And Jesus is telling this story.
Right.
Okay? This isn't necessarily a true story.
Right.
And the boy turns around and goes to his father. And his father sees him coming from a long way off. It implies the father's been looking for him to come back for a long time. Oh, I'm about to cry. Powerful story. But it's only a story. It's not a true story.
But it conveys something true.
But it conveys the truth.
Just because a story's not real doesn't make it untrue. And stories can be especially powerful when they speak to your personal life experience.
I left the church. I left all religion. As a young man, I just walked away. And one day I came face to face with spiritual reality. God knows a better way for my life than I do.
Although he was having success, Clifton found himself in a crippling drug addiction, and he credits this direct, spiritual experience with God for pulling him out of it. That's why the story Jesus told is such a powerful one for Clifton. It speaks directly to his life.
I was the prodigal son. You know, I was in the pig pen, and he put a robe on me. You know, he didn't even bathe his son before he put a robe on him.
That's true.
He put the new robe on his prodigal son coming home before he even washed up from the pig pen. He accepted him with his stench, with the stench of the world, because he knew in his heart it was purity. And God does that for all of us. And in time, he'll give you a bath.
Yeah. Great.
In my time with Clifton Davis, I saw that same part of us that responds to a really powerful performance, whether it be a play, a parable, or any other kind, is the same thing in us that gets so turned off by something like religious hypocrisy. Because if something's truly going to connect with us, there needs to be something underneath the mask, something genuine, something true.
I think what's so powerful about a great stage performance is that although it takes place in a context that the audience knows is a charade, it's able to communicate powerful truths. But what upset Jesus so much about many of the religious people of his time was that they did the exact opposite. They took something intended to be profoundly real and instead made it fake, meaningless. As a prophet, Jesus fought against that, promoting a life without judgment, a life of honesty, humility, a life of forgiveness and acceptance. Like the prophets before him, Jesus tried to turn people back to God.
The Gospels present another prophet in addition to Jesus, John the Baptist. All 4 Gospels mention him, describing him as the son of a priest who grew up in the wilderness, wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and honey. He preached and baptized right here by the Jordan River. By all accounts, he had a huge following. In fact, the writings of the first-century historian Josephus contain even more references to John the Baptist than to Jesus. Yet, as popular as he was, the Gospels present him as a prophet that pointed to the coming of another one who was even greater than he. The Gospels are saturated with references and allusions to Jewish scripture, or what Christians call the Old Testament. The significance of these references is enormous. Jesus is not just any prophet. He is the one who previous prophets have pointed to. The books of the prophets Isaiah, Zechariah, Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and more all contain writings that find their fulfillment in the life of Jesus. But perhaps the most significant comes from Israel's greatest prophet, Moses. In the book of Deuteronomy, he writes, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." The Gospel's presentation of Jesus has many allusions to Moses. Like Moses, Jesus was supposed to be killed as a child, but instead found refuge in Egypt. Like Moses, Jesus delivered his law on a mountain, and like Moses, he fed the children of Israel in the wilderness. John writes that after Jesus fed thousands of people, they responded by saying, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into this world." The Gospel's message regarding this prophet is clear. He is not just any prophet. He is the one true prophet.
Jesus makes an incredible statement in the Gospel of John, saying, "You search the Scriptures because you think they give you eternal life, but the Scriptures point to me." When you think of how sacred Scripture was to them at that time, how it continues to be for so many now, it really becomes such a radical, revolutionary, almost crazy claim that basically all of the prophets, all of Scripture even, existed to point to this one guy. If that's true, it's easy to see why the phrase he used more than any other was, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear."
This is Mount Tabor. It is also referred to as the Mount of Transfiguration, named after the event in Jesus' life. The Gospels present this story in spectacular fashion. Jesus climbs the mountain with 3 of his disciples to pray. As he is praying, his appearance begins to change. His face begins to shine with a bright light, and his clothes are like a flash of lightning. And then 2 of Israel's greatest prophets, Moses and Elijah, appear and begin to talk to Jesus. They talk to him about his mission, about what he was going to fulfill. The disciples wake up and start to stammer, but then a cloud appears and God himself speaks, saying, "This is my chosen one. Listen to him." A prophet's life was about delivering the message of God to improve their world. And in this moment, God is pointing to Jesus as a prophet unlike anyone the world had ever seen. Someone with a special mission. Someone who would change the world like never before. The prophet said it. Jesus said it. Now God himself was saying it. Look at him. Listen to him. And see the world become changed.